Welcome back. It's time now for the France 24 debate. Today we're in Israel, a country that's on track for its fifth election in the space of 3 years. That's because the Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has called for Parliament to be dissolved and for a new election to be held. Well, in line with his coalition deal, the Foreign Minister Yair Lapid is going to take over the premiership in a caretaker capacity until a replacement is elected. Well, there are still a couple of hurdles to be cleared before Parliament is dissolved, but if this happens as planned, an election date will then be set. Not more than 5 months from the day the bill is written into law. Well, France 24's Joseph Keane tells us a little bit more about how we've reached this point.
After 3 years of political fractures and 4 elections, the Israeli Prime Minister announced the decision to go to the polls again in a televised national address.
Israeli citizens, we are standing before you today in a moment that is not easy, but with the understanding we made the right decision for Israel.
The coalition government, which includes parties from across the political spectrum, lost its majority earlier this year. Bennett initially formed the alliance in June 2021 after 4 inconclusive elections. It involved a diverse range of parties, ranging from factions that supported an end to Israeli occupation of lands captured in 1967 and those who opposed Palestinian independence. It also made history by becoming the first coalition to include an Arab party, but the bloc unravelled in large part due to compromises made which were unable to please all factions. It was able to form in the first place in order to reject the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu.
There is a need here to rehabilitate the state of Israel, and we have the ability to do so. I intend to establish a national, strong and stable government.
Opinion polls have forecast Netanyahu's hardline Likud to be the largest party, but it remains unclear if he would be able to form a government. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid will now take over from Bennett on an interim basis. The vote is expected to take place in the autumn.
So, what happens next for Israel? Does this pave the way for a Benjamin Netanyahu comeback? And what does the Israeli public make of this ever-revolving election merry-go-round? Well, those are some of the questions I'll be putting to our panel today. Live from Tel Aviv, we're joined by Dor Harlop, who is a consultant for the Likud party. Welcome to you. From Jerusalem, we're joined by France 24's correspondent Iris Makler. Here in the studio, I'm with John Linden, Executive Director for the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And we're also joined by Yossi Yona, who is a former Knesset member, former Labour Party member and philosopher at Ben Gurion University. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us. Let me start with you, John, since you're here with us in the studio. You've come all the way to see us. What was it, in your opinion, that made this fragile coalition collapse? What was the last straw?
I mean, it was death by 1,000 cuts, really, over the last year. I mean, in the first day, almost, one MK for Naftali Bennett's ruling Yamina party said he'd be voting with the opposition. And then since then, it's been an exercise in trying to manage what is the most unusual coalition in Israeli governmental history. The final blow really came in the last 2 to 3 months, where again, Yamina, that's the right-leaning party of the Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, 2 of his MKs have been sort of, will they, won't they, vote with the government or the opposition, ostensibly for one of them around issues of religion and state, but some people assume that that wasn't necessarily the case, and for another around the discomfort, really, of sitting in government with Arabs. And that is the most important thing about this year-long experiment that this coalition has been. It's the first coalition in Israeli history that has had Arabs at the centre of it. And not just that, the left and the right, the religious, the secular, it really is an unprecedented thing. And many observers are kind of amazed that it lasted as long as it did because of that. And it's worthwhile noting the 8 parties that make up the coalition, the leaders really did stay united until the very end, very surprisingly. It was really keeping the foot soldiers, the backbench MKs, in line when their own base, from the right to the left, were increasingly uncomfortable with some of the compromises that such a heterogeneous coalition demands.
Yossi Yona, do you agree with that assessment? I mean, what would be for you the key event or events that really brought about the dissolution of this coalition?
Netanyahu. It's one word, Netanyahu. Because you see, people might think that there is a split, but on a border scheme, there is no split, because if Netanyahu is stepping down, the right-wing parties would be able immediately to form a coalition government. So it is, when you're talking about the split is between those who dislike Netanyahu, viewing him as a threat to Israel's future democracy, and those who actually endorsing him, supporting him, and want him to come back and to hold power. So this is the very interesting thing, because the Israeli society is actually moving to the right. So it seems, and this is a very interesting thing, that the very fact that Netanyahu is still a player in the political scene, it gives some kind, if you wish, some hope or some role to the left-wing parties in the Israeli parliament, as we have seen, they were part of the coalition government. I'm talking about the Meretz party, and I'm talking the Labour party, which means that, again, if Netanyahu steps down, I'm not seeing it happening, but just think about that, how paradoxical it is the case that the right-wing parties may compose probably about 70 or 80 seats of the parliament out of 120. So it is not exactly kind of a split on ideological reasons, but on the issue of the person. It is essentially a personal issue that actually bringing us from one election to another.
Okay, let's get a reaction to some of what you said from Dor Harlop. And I'd also like to ask you, Dor, I mean, were you surprised that this unlikely government lasted as long as it did, nearly a year?
No, I'm pretty sure, I was sure that they will last even another extra year, because I saw that all the segments, all the parties in this government have gained gains that they would never have in the usual circumstances. It's important to say that, just as Yossi Yona, MK, former MK, have said, it's ridiculous because this government only became possible because of personal prohibition, personal effects against Netanyahu. And if you will take Netanyahu out of the equation, the most of the Israeli population is going towards the right wing, right ideology. The only issue which is turning to be different than it used to be until now is the ability to work together with some of the Arab representatives. I believe that there's a good chance that even Netanyahu will try to form a government with Mansour Abbas. I personally think it's a good thing, as long as the Arab parties try to work together and not trying to work against Israel. It's important to say that even with the 1 year of Netanyahu leading with Benny Gantz, with this half government that used to be, Netanyahu was one of the biggest leaders that the people of Israel have had since King David. He brought many accomplishments to the state of Israel with the corona, with COVID-19, working against with the vaccines in the corona, with Abraham agreements. I think that he is the best Israeli leader that we had until now, and he brought us those accomplishments when he had his hands tied. I believe that we are going to elections that the Likud will get 40 seats out of 120, and Netanyahu will be able to gain a wide, large, coherent coalition, and will be able to continue the state of Israel for a prosperous future.
Okay, I'll let the others react to that in just a moment. I'd just like to go around the table and let everyone...
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can absolutely hear you. I'd like to just go to our correspondent in Jerusalem, and before everyone has had once everyone's had a chance to express their opinions, please do jump in and interrupt and debate. It is, after all, a debate. Iris, what was the reaction last night? I mean, it's been about 24 hours since this news broke of the dissolution of the coalition. I mean, do you get the impression, getting a bit fed up there in Israel, given that we could be on track there for a fifth election in 3 years?
Yes, they are fed up and a bit apathetic, and it's not compulsory voting here. So that also feeds into it. There is some sense, I just saw a headline saying that the Arab vote will actually be the determinant of this election. And what that means is if the Arab voters are disenchanted with this experiment of Mansour Abbas, of the Islamist party Ram, sitting in the government, and they don't turn out to vote, then they will hand the election to Benjamin Netanyahu and to the right-wing bloc. It is currently, I just saw the most recent television polls, Netanyahu still leads the largest party. His bloc reaches 60, but as has been for the past 2 years of, those 2 terrible years of election after election with no decision, no one reaches 61. No one reaches a majority without the Arab party, without Mansour Abbas. So although today Netanyahu said he would not sit in government with Mansour Abbas, that's a pre-election promise, and they are not always held to in Israeli politics, as we see in other places too. So I think that part of the reaction here will determine how enthusiastic people are about voting yet again. And I think it also depends what side of the line you stand on. One of the parties that's going to do well, it seems, or better than last time certainly, is the religious right. So their followers are very pumped. They're very happy and they intend to go to vote. They think this is great. I think the Likud thinks it's pretty good too. So I think how you feel about it, certainly I think where you stand determines how you feel, as in so many things.
Yeah, I mean, didn't Benjamin Netanyahu go a little bit further than saying he wouldn't enter into a coalition or an agreement with an Arab party? He said it would be an unforgivable sin, an act of treason against the homeland. I mean, if he can't win without the support of an Arab party, why would he make such strong comments as to say it would be an unforgivable sin and an act of treason to entertain such an idea?
Well, it wouldn't be the first time that he's used quite inflammatory language against Israel's Arab or Palestinian minority, who make up over 20% of the population. Yet it was actually Prime Minister Netanyahu who normalised the idea of sitting in coalition with Arab parties in the first place. He was the one that opened the gates essentially to this prospect in the last round of elections last year. And that, of course, then opened up space for Yair Lapid, definitely to the left of Prime Minister Netanyahu, to say, well, if it's good enough for the right, then surely it's good enough for the centre as well. And I think if we zoom out, it's difficult because this wave of 5 elections has everybody a little bit punch drunk, and it's exhausting.
Even though it's important for me to, sorry for interrupting you.
Go ahead.
Yes, sorry for interrupting. Yes, sorry for interrupting you, but I don't think it's the same thing when Netanyahu is willing to sit with Mansour Abbas and when Yair Lapid is sitting with Mansour Abbas. Because if Netanyahu will do that, it will be one of many alternatives that he has. Maybe sitting with Benny Gantz, or maybe sitting with Gideon Sa'ar if he didn't do a personal ban on Netanyahu. So Netanyahu have many options, and the Arab party of Mansour Abbas doesn't have the only key for the coalition. He has many options. That gives. Excuse me, what did you say?
Iris, go ahead.
I was going to say no. He didn't have so many options.
That when you have alternatives,
have so many options.
It's important and it's a possibility to do that.
Iris, can you just go ahead.
I'll repeat that. Sorry. I don't agree with that, because the reason Netanyahu didn't have so many options the last time, and I'm not sure he'll have so many options this time either, we'll see, but he didn't have so many options the last time. That's why he was negotiating with Mansour Abbas. It wasn't that he had so many other parties begging to be in the coalition. He tried and he failed.
Yes, but he didn't have the options.
He didn't. He couldn't do it. Options he may have had, but results he didn't. So
I believe that now, when Yair Lapid.
Can I just jump in and say this is unrecognisable from the Israeli political reality that existed before this wave of elections. The idea that we're debating over, which party from the right or the centre needs or could use the Arab vote more, but pricing in as an assumption that, of course, it's legitimate that this Arab party can sit in either coalition. It's extraordinary. This was the biggest taboo in Israeli electoral politics since the foundation of the state. And I think what historians will look at as being transformational is how this sped up phase of election after election after election, it accelerated a natural process of the expansion of the demos in Israel. I mean, it's a good thing. Every citizen in the country and the parties that represent them are now potential parties of government. If we think about the United States, I think African Americans make up 10 to 12% of citizens. Yet it's impossible to imagine the Democratic Party having a coalition, an electoral coalition, without that. Arab citizens, Palestinian citizens, some prefer being called by, make up over 20% of the Israeli population, but they've been taken out of the electoral cycle, or the electoral constellation, since the foundation of the country, as I mentioned. So everything is different now. And I know everyone's exhausted by this fifth election. This election is different. It's the first one in the history of the state where at the point of origin, when the election is called, everything is to play for every single seat in the Knesset. And I would just say also, it's interesting with the joint list. So it still says that it will not sit. And I think the other parties also are reluctant to incorporate them. Now, the joint list had 15 seats at their APACs a few elections ago. Now we have RAM, the party who are in the coalition, and the joint list together making up around 10 in the polling that's being conducted. And if that can be expanded, we had 43% turnout of Arab citizens in the last election. That's almost over 30% less than the electoral average in the country. If that turnout goes up, and I think Iris mentioned it earlier on.
Yes, but I don't believe that the joint committee. I don't think that the joint party is an alternative to be part of anything. The joint party, some of their representatives are terror supporters. I'm sorry to say that, and I don't see them as a relevant or a legitimate option for being part of the government in Israel.
Let's ask Yossi. Yossi, you've been very quiet the last couple of minutes.
Against the state of
Yossi Yona, give us your opinion. What's changed these last 12 months since Israel last went to the polls?
Well, two main points. First, I agree that anti-election campaign is different than post-elections. What it seems to be impossible before the elections is miraculously is becoming possible after the election. And so this is a point to be made, and I don't think that Netanyahu would rule any possibility, whether it is the Islamic Party or the joint list, and that if this would be the only option that would enable him to form a coalition, government. Now, another thing is that this hope that Netanyahu would be able to form a coalition government with right-wing parties like Gideon Saar's party, Gantz party, when it is also possible, because you see, I mean, we're talking about politics, so everything, politics is a mechanism that is transforming the impossible into possible. But nonetheless, we've got to remember.
It's an option.
Yeah, we've got to remember the amount of resentment that being harbored by Gantz and by Gideon Saar towards Netanyahu. There is a complete lack of trust that it would be, of course, the public has a very short memory, but the support, whatever support that the Gideon Saar is now receiving from the Israeli public, and as well as Gantz is receiving from the Israeli public, it would disappear, it would evaporate. Should they decide following the elections to join efforts by Netanyahu to form a coalition government. And the last point, I would like to join my friends here on the panel. Yeah, I do agree that the very fact that it is the first time in Israeli history an Arab party became a part of a coalition government, I think it is revolutionary. Now, it is revolutionary. It is not even. I'm not saying that it necessarily would be repeated, but the very fact that it happened, it just broadened the political imagination, and I do endorse this very much, and especially that it is a right-wing government that actually made the effort and called on the Arab list, the Islamic Arab list, to be part of government, meaning that it increases the legitimacy of the Arab vote in Israel society. And I do endorse it, and I think it's a very positive development, though what we see around, of course, it's emergence of intolerance, racism, nationalism, fascism, and all the kind of curses that we are facing in Israeli society. But, well, this is some kind of comfort, that even in the midst of this darkness, the Israeli politics have done a revolutionary step towards the Arab population of Israel.
And maybe just to add to that as well, it hasn't just been the symbolism of an Arab party sitting in government, as important as that is. There's been material gains for the Arab community in Israel as a result, even in this short year-long government.
I agree.
We've had billions of shekels put into security for Arab communities. There's been a wave of crime and violence that's been plaguing Arab cities and towns for a long time. And actually, credit to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He actually made the first investment when he was Prime Minister, but now it's been radically increased by the current government. And there's a 5-year plan that could see somewhere $9 billion invested over 5 years into these communities that have been neglected for such a long time. And it's an example of what happens when political power is connected to a community. But the one sort of third rail nobody has touched off yet is the conflict. We haven't even mentioned it so far in this conversation. So the rule for the coalition that stood for a year was, we don't agree on this most divisive issue that's really framed Israeli politics since 1967. And what will be interesting in this election campaign to come is whether and if the conflict is raised again. Because you asked in your first question why the coalition fell. One of the reasons was the violence we saw in the spring, particularly some violence on Al-Aqsa, on the Temple Mount, which for a moment threatened the coalition and indeed threatened Ram, the Arab party, who sort of stayed away from the Knesset for a number of days in sort of protest over the violence that they saw. And I think the only way you're going to get real Arab-Jewish unity over the long term is if there can be a way found to address the conflict. And I don't think anyone has figured out how to do that yet.
And I want to add to this, I think it's a very important point, how the
I
Israeli...
totally disagree with you. I'm sorry.
Hold fire, Dor. Let's let Yossi say his point, then we'll come to you.
Yeah,
it's important for me to say.
I was about to say that, one of the results of this fragile coalition that at the end of the day went down gloriously, to put it that way, Bennett is falling on its soul. This is what happened. He went down gloriously. But what I wanted to say is one of the big prices for the center and left center parties that they have paid for the relative stability of this government is that they were willing to not only to neglect the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but allowing Bennett's government to push ahead with the settlement project. And they were willing to pay that because the evil was Netanyahu, and they believe that any price that they would have to pay, they are willing to pay, so that Netanyahu would not be holding back, the power, the political power in Israel.
Don't make your point.
I believe that you give them a big credit. Yes, you're giving them a large credit. One of the main reasons for all these left-wing parties to keep on is because they had the seats. Merav Michaeli is today a minister, she's the transportation minister. It's a very high official senior elected seat. I don't think that the Labour Party will have this kind of seat in the next few years, and it wasn't like that in the last couple of years also. It's a great opportunity for me to call all the people that I know that are in France and they have dual citizenship and are citizens in Israel and allowed to vote. Come to Israel for the elections and vote for Netanyahu. We know that you, the French, that are also Israeli, you can be the turning point. There are a few thousand
election campaign now.
Please come for the elections day.
Let's go to Iris
and support Netanyahu.
Okay.
Yes,
I just want to ask you. I want to ask Iris, because we've had lots of conversations.
Jewish French people have a great support in Netanyahu.
Okay. Super. Iris, let me ask you, we've talked a lot this last 12 months. We've done numerous lives about the security situation in Israel, and we've talked a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Has there been any progress, in your opinion, during these last 12 months on that front, or would you agree broadly with what's been said so far?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That was the decision. The deal, if you like. We, the centre and left-wing parties who might be interested in some progress on this, will go into this knowing that there'll be no progress. And I agree with Yossi Yona that what we saw, in fact, was some steps being taken towards the settlers in the West Bank, and that's because of the right-wing parties within the government and the portfolios they held, including the Prime Minister. So I don't think there has been progress on that. And I don't think anyone would pretend. And interestingly, although it was, the settlements in the West Bank was nominally the issue which prompted this crisis, because Israel hasn't annexed the West Bank. What it does is it renews regulations, and the opposition, Netanyahu's opposition, was playing very hardball, and they refused to renew the regulations that allow the law to function within the West Bank, that allow Israeli law to apply within the West Bank.
The interesting thing here is that even the American administration were willing to pay a price that Netanyahu would not come back to power. This is the interesting thing, which means that they enabled or allowed, maybe tacitly, to Bennett to go on with expanding the settlement project. As long as Netanyahu would not come back to power, the Americans were kind of, as I was saying, tacitly kind of endorsing or tacitly overlooking, if you wish, what actually is happening in the West Bank. And this is also we've got to take into account. And the question, of course, why? Because, again, the animosity, the resentment, the deep resentment that actually transpired between Netanyahu and the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, Biden himself, don't want to see him back in power. So Biden, American administration, it is paradoxical. They also were being willing to pay the price for that, which means that, and this is the interesting question, suppose that Netanyahu were to be a prime minister, I'm not sure that the American would be consenting to the steps that actually Bennett has taken vis-a-vis the settlement project. This is very interesting.
I'd say one other thing about that. I think Biden, I agree that they have been overlooking Israel, but I think they've been overlooking Israel altogether because Biden had a lot of problems at home. He had COVID to deal with, he had Afghanistan to deal with, he's had Ukraine to deal with. I don't think Israel is high on his list of priorities, although I do agree with you that the net result of that has been that Bennett was able to take steps perhaps that Netanyahu would not have been.
Let me come to you, John. I just want to ask you, because we know that President Biden, is going to Israel in the next few weeks, in mid-July, He's going to be received by a different acting prime minister by then. It will be Yair Lapid and not Naftali Bennett. And we heard Lapid speaking a bit earlier on. He said that this is going to be a very significant visit for the region. Was there something sort of cloaked in that message of Yair Lapid, do you think?
Well, you've got to remember that up until today, until next Wednesday, Yair Lapid is the foreign minister, and he's been working pretty diligently on this regional normalisation portfolio and file, amongst others as well. So we know with the Abraham Accords, we saw radical upgrading of relations between Israel and various Arab states, but smaller Arab states. The big prize, I think, for Israel, and I think increasingly for the Biden administration as well, is some sort of upgrade incrementally in Saudi-Israeli relations. None of us know where that process is. We've seen jets flying back and forth between Tel Aviv and Riyadh and Jeddah in recent weeks. And we know that President Biden will be going to Saudi Arabia directly after his visit to Israel. So we can maybe deduce that there's something being cooked up. And from Yair Lapid's perspective, what an electoral tool. It's interesting. Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the most talented politicians I think we've seen in Israel or anywhere. He leveraged incumbency in an incredible way in elections. He would unveil these kind of gains for the electorate at each electoral cycle, whether it was the annexation pledge, the speech in Congress he did when Barack Obama was president, then the Abraham Accords themselves, ways in which he could push up his vote share in advance of election day. And I wonder, with Yair Lapid being prime minister for 3 or 4 months before the election, if he could pull off some sort of grand bargain with the Saudis.
Take a page out of
out of Netanyahu's book, absolutely.
If Yair Lapid,
Go ahead.
If Yair Lapid will be, you say that Netanyahu did all these things only for election reasons. Yes.
I didn't say that.
But if Yair Lapid will be able to do some good things for the state of Israel on that period of time, it will be great. I don't see it problematic for electoral reasons. That's their job, what they need to do.
I agreed. And I think one thing to add maybe just on the Palestinian file as well. Yes, the Biden administration hasn't spent a ton of political capital on that issue, but it's also worthwhile looking that the Israeli coalition was unable to support a genuine diplomatic process, and the Palestinians themselves also are suffering under many different forms of dysfunction and division that make a real meaningful final status process really unlikely, and we haven't seen one since 2014. One thing I would love to see President Biden do in his visit is to sketch out a more medium to long-term vision, and actually looking at what happened with Israel, with the Arab and Jewish political partnership. That didn't fall out of space. That was a result of 20 years of civil society work, many Olmec members working to build Jewish-Arab cooperation after the terrible violence in October 2000. And if we could take a similar approach to this cross-border environment and say, look, nothing is ripe right now for final status diplomacy, but I as President Biden, I'm going to come and invest in a significant way in civil society, in organizations and movements that can bring Israelis and Palestinians together at scale, form the sort of relationships that we've seen formed within Israel amongst Arabs and Jews, cross-border, and over time begin to build from the bottom up the sort of consent and support and momentum that we know a peace process depends upon. We've never seen it in Israel-Palestine. We have these, diplomatic processes where John Kerry, will say we're going to have a final status deal in 9 months, but none of the preparation and foundations are there. And we at Olmec, we've been campaigning for an international fund based upon when we saw in Ireland that did that 12 years before a peace deal, invested over $2 billion in the sort of organizations and movements that then makes peace possible for the leaders. And what we've seen in this electoral cycle and previous, Israeli politicians are like politicians everywhere. They're cynical. If they feel as if there's momentum and movement and a constituency for something, they will take risks, like bringing Arabs into governments for the first time. At the moment, in both Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza, there isn't sufficient constituencies pushing their leaders towards those sort of positions. And that's something President Biden can do on this visit that would set his legacy on this issue.
Yeah, Yossi, let me ask you, because we're talking about new developments and what might be different this time around. And I'm thinking all the while I was listening to John about how the Saudis are these new allies of the Israelis. I mean, do you see them having any role, any influence, or breathing new life into some sort of peace process or journey towards a peace process?
One hope that there would be some kind of influence. Because the official position of the Gulf states, Gulf countries, is that they actually view the Abraham Accords as those that would include, at the end of the day, well, of course, when is going to be this the end of the day, that would include some kind of a progress towards the Israeli-Palestinians relation. But of course, they have their own interests. They're exposed to their own threats from Iran. And the alliance between Saudi, Gulf states, and Israel is very important. Now, think about two scenarios. Now, suppose that Netanyahu is indeed going to form a new government. I don't see any progress there. And he would opt, as many governments in the past, opting for what they're called economic peace, economic peace, kind of, this is instead of like solving a final status solution to the conflict. Now, suppose that Yair Lapid would form the new government, he would need right-wing parties as part of his coalition, which means paralysis again. So I don't see that we're going to make any real progress, and no matter who's going to form a new coalition government following on the next election.
Okay, let me ask a totally different question. I mean, in every election, and we're assuming we're coming up for an election.
I don't believe that there is.
Go ahead, Dor.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, I'm just saying that I don't see an option that someone else will be elected and be able to form coalition. I think that if Netanyahu will get 61 seats, he will be prime minister, and if he won't be able, we will have Yair Lapid being as a acting prime minister. I don't see how Yair Lapid is going to get 61 seats. I don't, and form a coalition. I don't see it happening. So I just believe that we will go to 6 round of elections if Netanyahu won't gain 61 seats for his coalition.
But that'll keep you very busy, Eric.
I don't see any other Yeah. So if someone here thinks something else that I
no, well, I've got another question I wanted to put to Iris.
This option happening.
Iris, let me ask you, because I mean, you're a resident of Israel, as two of our other panelists are as well. I mean, one thing we talk about when we lead up to any election is the economy. The economy of Israel seems to be firing on all cylinders. It grew 8.2% in 2021. The forecast for 2022 is 5%. I mean, can Naftali Bennett claim any credit for that, do you think? Or is it likely that some of the good work that was done by his predecessor is really what's generating these kind of economic results that we're seeing right now?
It's funny, the results are
Sorry.
That was for Iris, that question.
Out, but I think it's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to say thank you. Okay, sorry.
Iris, we're back to you. Yeah, there's a bit of a delay. Iris, go ahead.
Yes, so the economy has been doing better. The coalition government would argue it's because there was a budget for, there wasn't a budget. Israel was functioning without a budget for almost 3 years. So one of the first things and the most important things that this new government that is just dissolving or about to dissolve did was actually to pass a budget and to start working and to get the economy going after COVID. So Israel handled COVID well, credit for which should go to Benjamin Netanyahu amongst other people, and this excellent health system and the risks that they were willing to take to get a vaccine quickly, all of that. But now, even though you're right, those indicators are great and the economy is doing well when you look at it externally, inside, it feels just like it does everywhere else. Prices are rising. It's very hard to buy apartments. The prices for those are skyrocketing too. Basics are starting to cost more, and that's everything from flour to cheese to petrol. So all of those things that you say are correct. But if you listen to Israelis talking, they talk about how much the cost of living is increasing.
Sure. John, you're here with me in the studio. Can I just put a question to John very quickly here in the studio, just picking up on the economic factor, which is that when I looked at what the markets had done, what the shekel was doing against the dollar as a result of the announcement made by Naftali Bennett yesterday, pretty much no reaction whatsoever. Does that mean that the economy is ticking along pretty nicely and let's just leave the political class to squabble and we'll just get on with making a living, shall we?
Yeah, I mean, elections and strikes and wars are kind of priced into the Israeli political life. So in that sense, there's a lot of resilience relative to other sort of liberal democracies, I guess. But I think there is a vulnerability here. The cost of living crisis in Israel, we're going through one now, obviously, in Europe and the West. We have been going through one, arguably, since the financial crisis. Israel's been going through one even longer. The gaps between rich and poor in Israel are some of the biggest in the OECD. And it's worthwhile remembering that, in retrospect, maybe the biggest moment of political fragility for Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister were the social protests, 10 years ago, I guess, or so, when 300,000 people took to the streets of Tel Aviv, Rothschild Boulevard, calling for some sort of help, to be able to buy a house, to be able to afford basic goods. And because we're now globally going through this inflation crisis and cost of living, that vulnerability is more acute for whoever is going to be the prime minister of Israel in the coming period. And it's strange. Israel has a social democratic consensus, really. The left to right debate that people have on national security, it's not reflected really in economics in the same way. And there is consensus for things like the welfare state and for looking after the poorest citizens. But we have seen a drift towards the neoliberal right on economic policy since about 20 years, since Benjamin Netanyahu was finance minister, probably. So there could be a recalibration there. And one thing that we've seen in other democracies recently is countries that blend nationalism with economic populism, leaders tend to be very, very successful. And if a party of the right and the national camp was to embrace that sort of economic package, I think it would be a very powerful electoral message to Israelis.
Yossi, go ahead.
I want to add to that. When we're talking about the strength...
I would like to say... okay.
It's Yossi's turn.
When we're talking about the strength of Israel economy, usually we're looking at it as kind of a business venture. And we're saying as long as the profit line, is positive, well, the economy is doing very well. So I endorse that, kind of truism. The Israeli economy is doing very well. But as was mentioned before by my colleagues here, that we are actually witnessing growing socioeconomic gaps in Israel. And it seems that on the verge of a new social movement protest in Israel. I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. Now, this is one point. Another point that I want to make, and this is very, again, interesting thing, you know, when we're talking propaganda, we're talking about a political campaign, election campaign, there is some kind of, I don't know how we have to describe it, some kind of twisted thing that the ultra-nationalist parties in Israel, they're actually endorsing new liberal economic policies. So you have this kind of some kind of entity, how to put it, that in Israel, nationalism goes, of course, with social democratic rhetoric, but it doesn't go along with social democratic policies. This is very interesting. When you think about Yamina, when you think about even ultra right-wing parties, they are actually have this kind of sense of this deep dislike and even, I would say, kind of some kind of hatred towards all these social democratic values, which means that nationalist politicians are very astute and exploiting people's economic plights in order to climb up the ladder. Are they really concerned with the plight of the people? Well, the Israeli history has shown that the answer to this question is negative.
Dor, go ahead. You wanted to make a point.
Yes. My point is that now that you are asking about economy, I believe that we have a great opportunity to say thank you now that when we see how Israel responds to the world's decreasing activity in the economical. It's a great opportunity to thank Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, for creating and enabling this ecosystem that the Israeli economy has been thriving and prospering for the last 12, 13 years. I'm sitting here on Tel Aviv's roof, and I can see all of Tel Aviv's skyline, and it's all packed with international global companies that are coming from all around the world to work here. There is a great and big group that I'm a part of, which in the Likud, which is called Likud's Liberal. The Likud's Liberal is a great, today it's all around 10,000 party members of the Likud that are all working and pushing the Likud's party and all the right wing of the Israeli politics towards free market economy and towards capitalism, not merciless capitalism, but a good capitalism. And I believe that Benjamin Netanyahu has made in the last 12, 13 years, enabling this process of economy to continue through. It's a great opportunity to thank him for that.
Actually, this is the answer to Lyndon. That's exactly the answer now that we got it, very clear. Because Lyndon was saying before, you know, about strong social democracy in Israel, so forth and so on, and that there is some kind of intertwine between nationalism and social democracy. And here, I would say, official representative of the Likud party say, no, we actually endorsing liberal economy, free market economy, and so forth and so on. So again, that I would like to say.
It's important to say that the Likud is a democratic party. There are many
but we're talking about
many opinions in the Likud. It's important to say it's a democratic party.
We're talking about
I'm part of the Likud's party, but yes.
We're talking about policies, not talking about opinions. Well,
yes,
I welcome
the main Likud's
this kind of diversity
policy
and pluralism.
Okay.
But we're talking about
so
policies.
You can see on Netanyahu's. Yes, sorry for the delay.
We've got a minute or so left. I just want to put a question to Iris because I was reading a report that said that the campaign ahead of the October election is going to be, and I quote, brutal and malicious. As our correspondent in Jerusalem, I'd like to ask if you share that assessment and that likelihood.
Yes, I absolutely do. I'm preparing my flak jacket and my helmet. Yes, I do, because there's a lot to fight for. Parties are desperate. Some are not going to make the threshold. There's a desperation about that. And everybody's looking inward to their community and going to be fighting their corner, not necessarily against the opposition, but against the party closest to them as well, to make sure they get those votes. So you'll be centrist parties fighting each other, right-wing parties fighting each other, Arab parties fighting each other, and everybody fighting everybody else.
Well, hopefully lots of constructive debate as well. And this has been certainly a very useful prelude, and certainly it's been most enjoyable. Thank you so much. You've had the last word, Iris Makler in Jerusalem. Thank you to all the panellists. Dor Harlap, a consultant for the Likud Party. Thank you very much indeed to John Linden, Executive Director of the Alliance on Middle East Peace. Thank you to Yossi Yona, former Knesset member. Thank you to you for watching. Do stay with us here on France 24.